This is Pastor Arik, and you're listening to The Clergy Corner. Welcome to episode 281 of the special podcast about life and faith. I'm your host, Eric Borstad, the pastor of Ankeny United Church in Ankeny, Iowa, and it is my hope that this will be a time of reflection, healing, and wholeness for you. Well, my friends, today is Juneteenth, a holiday where we celebrate the emancipation of our African American siblings as they were granted the freedom that they so justly deserved. Now, I'll be honest, growing up in the very white suburb of West Des Moines, I was never taught about Juneteenth or the history around it, and only learned of it for the first time, maybe about a decade ago. But I think that's just a symptom of my privilege. And so I wanted to spend some time today going over explaining, that is, why Juneteenth is important for us, what it is all about, and why it matters to us as a church family. Now, for those who don't know, Juneteenth is a day of liberation and freedom. Even though the Emancipation Proclamation was made effective in 1863, it could not be implemented in places that were still under Confederate control. And as a result, in the westernmost Confederate state of Texas, enslaved people would not be free until much, much later. Freedom finally did come on June 19th, hence why today is Juneteenth, in 1865, 2 years later, when some 2,000 Union troops arrived in Galveston Bay. The Army announced that the more than 250,000 enslaved black people in the state were now free by executive decree. And so the day became known as Juneteenth by the newly freed people in Texas. Essentially, Juneteenth marks our country's second Independence Day. Although it has long been celebrated in the African American community, this incredible event remains largely unknown to most Americans, again, myself included, until about a decade ago. And I don't think this is particularly shocking, especially since Juneteenth wasn't declared an official holiday until 2021. And while it took me until my 20s to learn about Juneteenth and what its significance was to our country, I'm somewhat comforted knowing that as my boys grow up, they will learn about it at an early age, because Allison and I will teach it to them. We will impart its importance on them as they grow. Now, while Juneteenth is a day of celebration and emancipation, we also have to hold in tension the harsh reality of slavery that made such a day necessary. And while I can go on about how different forms of slavery and oppression still exist to this day, as a white man, I believe one of my responsibilities is to amplify the voices and experiences of my black siblings and to make sure that their words, their presence, take center stage. So to do that, what I want to do today is to share an article written by Jamar Tisby for the Clergy Coaching Network, in what is titled, "You Can't Appreciate the Joy of Juneteenth Unless You Understand the Sorrow of Slavery." So here is his submission in its entirety. One pattern I've noticed as people celebrate Juneteenth is a tendency to skip past slavery and rush to emancipation. Many people in the United States are quick to gloss over the unpleasantness of human bondage and simply celebrate the freedom that came afterwards. James Baldwin got it right when he said, quote, "It is worthwhile to point out that for most Americans, slavery is quite remote, and America herself would really prefer that we remained dispassionate about it. Well, I, for one, will never be dispassionate about slavery or any other unforgivable atrocity committed against humanity," end quote. You can't appreciate the joy of Juneteenth unless you understand the sorrow of slavery. I think the actual day of Juneteenth should be one of joy and exuberance. But leading up to Juneteenth, however, we should take a few moments to remember the crushing reality of slavery. And this isn't about being morbid or making a spectacle of human suffering. It's about honoring the history, the full history of Black freedom by recognizing the bondage that prevented it for so long. In my first book, The Color of Compromise, again, this is Dr. Tisby here, I talk about the story of Oluwada Equiano. He was an African born in the Igbo region of Nigeria around 1745, but he was stolen into slavery at a young age. He later gained his freedom, and he wrote an autobiography called The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Oluwada Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa, the African, written by himself in 1789. In the book, he explains the experience of waiting on the coast of the Atlantic in a prison called a factory, essentially a holding pen for Africans, while they waited for the slave ships to fill up and begin crossing the ocean. He explains, I quote, "The stench of the hold while we were on the coast was so intolerably loathsome that it was dangerous to remain there for any amount of time," unquote. On board the ship, he told of the tubs which held human excrement, quote, "into which the children often fell and almost suffocated," end quote. His younger sister was captured with them. They were separated but found each other for a brief instant and, quote, "clung to each other in mutual embraces, unable to do anything but weep," end quote. Yet just as abruptly as they had been reunited, they were sold to different enslavers. He writes, quote, "Scarcely had the fatal morning appeared when she again was torn from me forever. I was now more miserable, if possible, than before." Equiano then turned his attention to the professed Christians. Quote, "O ye nominal Christians, might not an African ask you, learned you this from your God, who says unto you, do all men as you would men should do unto you?" Slavery was family separation. Or then there's Harriet Jacobs, who was born enslaved in North Carolina in 1813. She also wrote an autobiography, entitled it Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Jacobs wrote of the constant danger that Black women and girls faced, not only as Black people, but as Black women. She explained to her readers the devastating choice she had to make as a teenager. She could either choose rape by her enslaver or voluntarily enter into an affair with a local white man. And she chose the later because she had hoped that the white man would free any children that they had. She was sure her enslaver would enslave his own children if they were born of a Black woman. And as she painfully unpacks this incident, she wrote to her women readers, especially white women, and said, quote, "But O ye happy women whose purity has been sheltered from childhood, who have been free to choose the objects of your affection, whose homes are protected by law, do not judge the poor desolate slave girl too severely," end quote. She demanded that people acknowledge the way that oppression limits your options. She put up a mirror to society and told others not to judge her actions when they have been defended, protected, and enjoyed by the privilege they have had their whole lives. Long before the term intersectionality arose, Harriet Jacobs exposed the perils of being both a Black and a woman in a racist and a sexist society. We must also speak something of what the practice of slavery did to the enslaver. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Slavery was a system where Black people had no rights and were considered inferior, and white people succumbed to the lie that they were a superior race and entitled to complete control of others. This kind of myth and power twisted the soul of the enslaver. As Frederick Douglass put it, no man can put a chain about the ankle of his fellow man without at last finding the other end fastened around his own neck, end quote. In Douglass's autobiography, he wrote of an enslaver named Captain Anthony and the brutality he used, sometimes simply for the amusement he got from it. He writes, Captain Anthony would at times seem to take great pleasure in whipping a slave. I've often been awakened at the dawn of day by the most heart-rending shrieks of an own aunt of mine, whom he used to tie up to a joist and whip upon her naked back until she was literally covered with blood. No words, no tears, no prayers from his gory victims seemed to move his heart from its bloody purpose. Douglas continued, "The louder she screamed, the harder he whipped, and where the blood ran fastest, there he whipped longest. He would whip to make her scream, and whip her to make her hush, and not until overcome by fatigue would he cease to swing the blood-clotted cowskin. I remember the first time I ever witnessed this horrible exhibition. I was quite a child, but I well remember it. I shall never forget it whilst I remember anything." End quote. And you'll sometimes hear the myth of the, quote, happy slave, or comments that enslavement benefited black people in some way, that they knew their place, that they had food, clothes, shelter, and work, that they became Christians. There's no sense in which black people were better off or happy under slavery. These descriptions should put to rest such notions. Race-based chattel slavery deprived people of African descent of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thankfully, through the sacrifices, prayers, and the spirit of justice in countless people, slavery was abolished in this nation. To fully appreciate the progress that Juneteenth represents, we also have to sit with the reality of the slavery that made it necessary. And that concludes the end of his article. To me, Dr. Tisby hits on an important point, one that we are tasked with wrestling with as we celebrate this holiday today. For while we celebrate the joy of freedom and emancipation, we must also recognize the horrors of slavery that made such a day necessary. And while we celebrate how far we have come, we must also recognize how far we still have yet to go. The systemic racism that is woven into our systems and society still rears its ugly head, and we are called to do what we can to make justice, to make equality a lived reality for all of our brothers and sisters in this world. So, my friends, as we celebrate Juneteenth today with joy and elation, let us also be mindful of where we have come from, the reality and pain of slavery, and the difficult road that still waits before us. Let us commit ourselves to changing this world for the better as we work toward a world where true liberation is experienced by us all. So until next time, be well, my friends. Amen. Thanks once again for listening. If you want to learn more about Ankeny UCC, go to ankenyucc.org. And if you want to write in a show suggestion or have any comments, you can send those emails to clergycornerpodcast@gmail.com.